This video is brought to you by AKS IAS.
Hello everyone, welcome to AKS IAS Academy. In this session, we are going to discuss about the recent GS paper 3, that is the mains economy part. And we know that there were around 6 to 7 or 7 questions which are related to economy. And in this session, we are going to discuss those economic questions which the UPSC is testing. The UPSC has framed these questions just to test the application knowledge of the candidates for preparing for this exam. The basic concepts were related to the current aspects and the questions were framed. So let me take this first question. The first question is, explain the difference between the computing methodology of India's GDP before the year 2015 and after the year 2015. First you have to understand what is GDP. GDP is nothing but gross domestic product, which is the total value of all goods and services produced within the country in a given period of time is GDP. Now in present financial year past, the pre-2015 CSO, that is Central Statistical Office, has started calculating making use of GDP. Earlier to GDP, we used to make use of gross value added. Gross value added means nothing but it's a GVA. GVA component and GDP component. So we have shifted from GDP to GVA. Again from GVA, we are back to GDP. So what is the reason? That is what the question is about. See, the simple reason is India felt that it should target sector-wise analysis. When we target sector-wise analysis, we used to calculate factor cost. That means GVA at factor cost. Gross value added, that means we can consider three important sectors, that is primary, secondary and tertiary. In primary sector, what is the value which is getting added, and that value when it transformed to manufacturing sector, so what is that value which we are getting. So overall the value is getting compounded and finally the value what we get is GDP. GDP is nothing but the summation of all the individual sectors, that is GVA. And what is India thought about? Why did India thought about to shift to GVA methodologies? GVA methodologies are nothing but we are targeting the production wise, that is we are targeting the supply side. GDP is nothing but targeting the consumer side, that is the demand side. So we thought that let us shift to production side, that is with respect to the supply side, and we started investing more on the concept of GVA. That means India started concentrating more on the individual components, that is in the primary, secondary and tertiary. Now when you know that the GVA value of individual sector is low or GVA value of individual sector is very high, then it makes very easy for us to target the sector wise. So we know in 2014 we also came up with the concept of Make in India, targeting the manufacturing sector, as the scope of manufacturing sector in terms of creation of the employment is very high. So what did India do? India shifted from GDP to GVA, concentrating that India can make lot of growth from the individual sectors. Now later we knew that GDP is also one of the most important tool. Now how GDP is going to impact us? See, GDP makes a cross border analysis, that is internationally if you want to compare with one country to another country, we make use of this global tool, that is GDP. So GDP will help you to make global analysis, and GDP is also very important tool which will help us to understand what is the growth level in each country, what is the scope of development in each country. Foreign investors also make use of GDP so that they can invest, and what is that growth they can get it out of their investment, that is the profits. Reserve Bank of India, Government of India in its fiscal and monetary policies also make use of GDP as their standard tool. Central Statistical Office also for the multiple calculations for in setting off of inflation rates, setting up of the most important data like labor bureau data, industrial worker data, also make use of this GDP only. And international institutions like World Bank, international institutions like IMF also make use of GDP for their global economic transactions. And what India thought is, even though if we follow GVA, it is targeting the sector wise analysis or sector wise growth, let us again shift back to GDP, so that GDP is such methodological tool which will help us to let us know, it will help us to understand what is the global standards of the country India when compared to the rest of the other countries. So that's the reason earlier we used to follow GVA methodologies, later we shifted to GDP methodologies. And also when you consider the base year, okay, base year earlier we used to have 0304, then we shifted to 2011-12. So these are the few important points which are related to the methodology of the calculations of GDP, what we used to follow earlier to 2015 and post 2015. So this is about your question number 1. And the next question is about differences between what is the capital budget and the revenue budget, and he is also asking you about the individual components of this capital budget and the revenue budget. Look, budget is nothing but the annual financial statement. Under Article 112, a budget is presented by the finance minister and the permission is given by the president every year in the parliament, that is in the Lok Sabha. Now, to understand this, the annual financial statement has two important components. One is the capital side, which is inclusive of all those assets which the government is making in terms of its expenditures or in terms of its receipts. So any asset, okay, which is government is making or government is creating or government is earning out of it will be considered under the capital part. So all these assets like strategic disinvestments or a making of assets like schools, hospitals, colleges, or any sort of establishments making use of government's bonds, schemes, policies, all this will be part of this capital expenditures or the capital receipts. That means out of this assets, if the government is earning anything out of it, then it will be part of capital receipts. And the other side, we look at the component, we have the revenue expenditure on the revenue receipts, which is part of the revenue account. Now, what is revenue expenditures? What is revenue account? Anything which is not part of capital will be included in the revenue account. So revenue account includes the revenue expenditures as well as the revenue receipts. See, revenue expenditures means the expenditures which are not creating any assets, but these are part of government's expenditures. So this could be like government plans, government schemes, government policies, or any subsidies, scholarships, or pensions, salaries, anything it can be which do not create any assets, but it is out of government's pocket, so we call it as an expenditures, that is revenue expenditures. What could be revenue receipts? Revenue receipts means anything which is government earning, okay, which do not attract any assets. That means government can earn based on what? Largest sources is taxes, other than taxes will be non-taxes. So in the revenue receipts part, again it could be classified into revenue, that is into the tax receipts and the non-tax receipts. Tax receipts can be further classified into the direct taxes and the non-direct taxes, that is indirect taxes. In the indirect taxes, the largest source of revenue will be from the GST, that is goods and services taxes, and the other side we have the direct taxes. Largest source of revenue will be the income tax and the corporate taxes, followed by the excise and the customs duty. Look, when it comes to the revenue side, government's largest earnings will be from the revenue side only, that is from the revenue receipts when compared to capital receipts. Receipts is nothing but what government is earning. Now, when we consider this aspect of revenue side, that is revenue receipts, when you take taxable and non-taxable, taxable receipts are very higher when compared to non-taxable receipts, because non-taxable receipts includes only few areas like you have penalties, you have fines, or anything government is earning profits, interest, etc. But together if we compare, the revenue account for the government will be very important when compared to the capital account. And we have like overall every year we calculate RD, that is revenue deficit. That means what? The total revenue expenditures minus the revenue receipts. If the expenditures of the government are very high when compared to the revenue receipts, then that leads to revenue deficit. See, what does FRBM Act says? Fiscal Responsibility Budgetary Management Act says that government has to maintain its RD, that is revenue deficit. In order it should maintain, finally the RD impact will be on fiscal deficit, which is nothing but the total expenditures minus total receipts. See, overall, when a foreign investors who invest in India will look into the revenue deficit of the government, fiscal deficit of the government, and what is the fiscal deficit is being maintained as per the FRBM Act, okay, and what are the suggestions made by NK Singh committee, and what is primary deficit, which is nothing but the fiscal deficit minus the interest payments of the previous governments, which the present government is clearing. So these are the individual components of these budget classifications, and finally this budget classification and different components needs to be explained, and 1 or 2 points about the FRBM Act and the NK Singh committee's suggestions, 15th Finance Commission suggestions could also add a lot of advantage for the aspirant to score a very good marks. And the next important question is about land reforms. See, most of the questions has been directly picked from the syllabus. So my suggestion to the aspirants is consider the syllabus and then start your preparation. You should always have a very good hold on the syllabus and what is the syllabus and how well you can add those syllabus to the current affairs. See, land reforms is the most expected and directly picked from your syllabus. So land reforms, and how is this going to benefit the small and marginal farmers? It's a very important question, very important topic. See, land reforms, you should write on about this little bit, the evolution of this reforms. It all started with the zamindari system. Later we moved to rayatwari system, where a rayat was appointed to abolish the zamindars, the intermediaries, the absentee landlordism, and finally, there was a role of mahajans, who was money lenders. To abolish all this, the Britishers brought the riots. Riots are the British agent who used to collect the taxes from the people who are directly involved in agricultural activity. Those you can say the serfs, or we can say the tenants. And this Raitwari system, and later we went into Mahalwari, where a village as a unit used to be considered, and the taxes and the where along with the Britishers, this village community head used to decide, and finally they used to hand over those taxes to the British government. See, in this process, they are the tenants which were held responsible for the agriculture activity. Due to this tenancy reforms, the tenants and the subtenants, they who used to work for a certain period of time has got a lot of advantage due to this British acts, that is the tenancy reforms and all. Now there were certain subtenants, due to this land reforms they did not get much advantage. There were also sharecroppers who also used to be employed, even they were in the disadvantageous side. So what the government has done, government has come up with the most topic, which is like structural reform, that is the institutional reform, and the technological reform, that is coming up with the technology, identifying and making up land surveys so that the small and the marginal farmers can be benefited. When you consider the other aspect of the consolidation, government has come up with a very clean picture, that is how the land reform has to take place. See, government started with the Land Ceiling Act first, then we moved into land consolidation, then we moved into cooperative farming, community farming, etc. Now, what is that most important operations which took place in West Bengal and rest of the India is Operation Barka. Operation Barka mostly was successful in West Bengal. That is, the people who were having a maximum percentage of the land needs to hand over the land to the government. And also Acharya Vinoba Bhave, the legend, he has come up with the most important movement which is known as Budhan movement. Now this could contribute, like around 1 million hectares of land to the government out of the target was 10 million. That means we can say partial it was successful because people used to hand over that percentage of land which was not useful to the agricultural activity. That means they used to hold more percentage of the land which was into agricultural side, and the other side, which is the land which cannot be used for agriculture, used to be handed over to the the government. Now this land used to be distributed for the marginal and the small farmer, that they were like the subtenants and the serfs or their sharecroppers. Now this land would not be at a one place, they could have been decentralized at different places or localized at different places. Then what is that government has to do? Government has to come up with the land consolidation, where land pooling has to be done for the further investment, so that this could come up with the community modeling techniques like community farming or any sort of cooperative farming, etc. Now what government did, what the best thing government has done for the small and the marginal farmers is the land ceiling. Okay, extra percentage of land which is held by the large case farmers has to be handed over, or the government based on its GIS surveys, etc., making use of technologies, could easily point it out, the people who are holding the maximum percentage of land and the people who used to hold less percent of the land needs to be diverted or needs to be transformed into their hands. Now due to land reforms, a lot of small and marginal farmers were benefited, and most, as of now we can say that the large scale farmers are still holding a large percentage of the land, and they are few in number. As if you consider the concept of stratification, large farmers hold the maximum percentage of the land, and they are very few in number, and the wealth they accumulate out of this is also very very high when compared to small scale and the marginal farmers. So land reforms, that is the structural reforms which the government has come up post independence, like tenancy reforms, ceiling act, consolidation, okay, and finally we moved into stage of cooperative farming, which has benefited a lot of the marginal and the small scale farmers by investing or the land pooling, etc. V-shaped recovery is the most expected question, because we all know during this COVID time, during this lockdown, the growth of GDP we have seen that the steep fall in the GDP and the steep rise in the GDP, this have taken the shape of a V. So what exactly is V? That means as the GDP was growing in the normal phase, and due to a sudden lockdown, what happened is there is no production activity going on, the demand got suddenly there's a steep fall, and the consumption, the luxury goods which you used to invest, you have to cut down it to the basic needs or the basic goods which are known as the compulsory goods, and the supply got reduced and also the demand got reduced. So you get to see there is a steep fall in the GDP, that is a steep fall in the GDP rate or the growth rate, and finally government has come up with certain measures to stop this fall by introducing the concept of fiscal policies, which are example lot of fiscal stimulus packages were introduced by the finance ministers, and also economic survey and 15th finance commission, as well as the finance ministry also like projected that the India has witnessed a V-shaped recovery, and basically economic survey itself says that India has witnessed a V-shaped recovery, and ASCOM International, okay, ASCOM, the trade unions, etc., also witness that India has, we get to see a V-shape model in the GDP recovery, and ASCOM also states that this V-shape is majorly due to introduction of introducing this vaccine. So due to vaccine, we get to see there is a large scale development in the society, in the country. Now remember, most economists and most scholars research say that in place of V it is U, because there was a steep fall, but the GDP growth rate has taken a lot of time to recover. When the GDP growth rate has taken a lot of time to recover, what happens is it may not take a V-shape recovery, rather it can take little bit time, so that will take a shape of U shape. So whether it is V shape or U shape, most important aspect is V, because economic survey says that India has attained a V shape recovery. And also the other shape recoveries like W shape recovery, Z shape recovery, K shape recovery is also being like projected by various research and scholars or economists, but V shape is the one which is the most predicted one as per the economic survey. See, this question is all about investments, okay, in infrastructure, and what is the role in the inclusive growth concept. See, inclusive growth means the growth which you attain should reach to all the sections of the society. It is called as inclusive growth. Every section of society should gain from that growth. That is the weaker sections, vulnerable sections, minorities, okay, the people who live in remote areas. So entire population, okay, which majorly should get benefited, that is considered as an inclusive growth. We can define that it is a growth which must reach to all the sections of the society, so majorly the deprived sections, etc. Now, how is this investments in the infrastructure can benefit this inclusive, or can come up with an inclusive growth concept? See, investments in infrastructure for the development of the health sector is very important, education is very important, connectivity for the transport is very important, education institutions are very important, and other social institutions are also very important. And investments has been one of the major agenda for the government right from 1990 LPG reforms, that is liberalization reforms, that is privatization reforms, and the globalization reforms. Now remember, India has come up with this liberal principles by coming up with reducing these trade and non-trade barriers, so that the foreign investments can happen in India that could lead to the growth. Now, most important aspects of this investments in infrastructure, government has come up with the various models, and recently we also know this question was framed on the background of national infrastructure pipeline investments models which the government has introduced. For example, we have very important investments models like build operate transfer model, engineering procurement model, viability gap funding, Swiss challenge model, hybrid annuity model. So all these models which was introduced so that the government can make assets without its capital expenditures. So you must be wondering that how can the government make assets without the capital expenditures? Is you involve this private sector so that you can compensate that your expenditures, or you can transfer those expenditures from your shoulders to the governments, that is the private sector shoulders, so that the private sector and the government can share now. So earlier it was like the private sector used to invest 100%, now the government is investing around 40% and the private sector is investing 60%. And the government also knew that when the government invests 40%, it could save 60%, and when the private sector is spending 60% and the 40% is from the government, and the burden is also less on the private sector, because most private sectors which were involved in build operate transfer model, they were investing, okay, for the creation of national highways, connectivity, okay, connectivity in rural areas with all this development of social institution, economic institutions, etc. Now this burden on the economic, like this burden on the private institutions were very high, and they were turning into the NPS. Now they did not worry about this 100%, rather they could get only 60%, they can easily get 60% of loans from the banks, and the government is supporting them with the 40%. Now what is government is benefiting out of this? Government, by reducing its capital expenditures, is creating an assets, and private sector, by not running into NPAs, can easily get this 60% and can invest. So it's a win-win situation for the government and the private institutions. Along with this, there is one more important aspect, like along with the 60% of investments, these private institutions are coming up with a very good model, that is engineering procurement model, where you come up with the very best design, best procurement, you create technology, you make employment, and you create connectivity in the various social sectors. So government has come up with this EPC model, where it will invest and get the private, okay, to bring one of the most important procurement process, engineering process with the best framework, so that government will allot those, okay, framework to those institutions which can come up with the very best model with at least 60% of expenditures. With this, you can make sure that government has come up with the various reforms like Swiss model, BOT model, EPC model, hybrid annuity model, so that these investments can take place in the various sectors of the economy, especially the social sectors, which can result in an inclusive growth. These were the various questions which were the examiner were trying to test, okay, the basic understanding of the candidate with the application knowledge of the daily newspapers. So my advice to the candidates who are preparing for the next year means, see, go through the syllabus properly, read every component of the syllabus and try to apply that syllabus to the daily newspapers, and having a basic knowledge of what is being taught in your daily classes. Along with this, you should also refer NCRTs, which are the most important books. Okay, I hope you will be getting benefited from this pure economy types of questions. Thank you.
This video is brought to you by AKS IAS.